Welcome to the Confidence in Singing podcast, where you can reclaim your voice and rediscover the joy of singing. I'm Aideen, and my guests include singers and voice experts who share their insights and journey to encourage singing for health, happiness, and fun. To support this podcast and join the Confidence in Singing community, just click on the Patreon link below. Welcome to the Confidence in Singing podcast. This is Aideen, and I'm very happy to welcome Mattia Maurée to the podcast today. And Mattia is a life coach and an interdisciplinary composer. They're particularly passionate about disability justice, trans rights, trauma recovery through the arts, and embodiment. Mattia, I'm so interested to find out a little bit more about all of these wonderful interests that you have, but also to find out a little bit about your journey as a musician, as a composer, and I suppose specifically for the Confidence in Singing podcast, what your journey's been like as a singer. Can you tell us a little bit about when you discovered how much the joy of singing for you? What was the circumstances? Where were you?
Oh, that's a good question. Hi, thank you. My parents are both musicians. My dad was a church musician and my mom was a music teacher. So I grew up around music all the time and started playing piano when I was 3 and violin when I was 4. And I did not formally take voice lessons until my teens, but because my mom taught voice, she taught me how to breathe very young. So I kind of, I was doing diaphragmatic breathing basically my whole life and just around people singing a lot. So I would say I've always known the joy of singing. We actually had a rule at our house that we were not allowed to sing at the dinner table because it would just get out of hand. We would all just be singing and not eating. So I was very much around singing all the time. And then it's funny because I practiced violin so hard, and it's a difficult instrument. And I feel like I put so much work in on violin to get to just a barely acceptable, get into college point. I was never going to be a soloist. And singing, when I started actually studying it and doing it, it just felt so much more natural. And probably because I already had developed the ear, from a childhood doing a pitched instrument where you have to, it's very pitch dependent.
Explain that for the people who don't understand this, because
sure.
For someone who's playing violin, I always say to my students when they start singing and they're like, I'll make a sound, and they're like, but how do I pick the right sound? And I just tell them that they have to guess, because it's not the same as picking out a note on a keyboard where you can see that the middle C is a certain place. So can you explain to people what that is like for a violinist?
Yeah. And actually, I think another good comparison is guitar. If you've seen a guitar, the little metal pieces on the neck are frets. And so if you push anywhere in between 2 frets, you're still getting the same note, basically. Versus on a violin, there's no frets. Anywhere you touch is going to be a different pitch. And it's just, there are an infinite possible number of pitches. And the voice is the same. Voice and violin are actually very similar. And voice, especially, I feel like that psychological component is so important, of having that intention and knowing what sound you're trying to produce. And that's kind of also just been my vocal journey, is both reimagining the sound that I'm trying to produce and then trying to actually get it.
Yeah, because it's not necessarily going to come out the way you hope it's going to come out. And so many factors affect how our voice sounds, even day by day.
Yep.
So, how you sounded earlier this morning versus how you're going to sound in the evening can be quite different.
Yeah, definitely.
So when you discovered that you were kind of comfortable singing and that you felt you had some skill there, more maybe natural affinity for using your own voice versus violin, what did you decide to do with that?
Well, it was also partly led because I was in a car accident and I couldn't play violin for a bit. So I started taking voice lessons. That was kind of the crux of it. And then I transferred schools. So I went to a school in the Midwest in the US that is known for choral singing. So I was like, okay, I'll just go there. I'll take voice lessons. I'll be in the choir, and just really enjoyed the whole process. And one of the things that I found in singing in group singing in particular, so I guess in choral singing or chamber choir, was that particular transcendent experience of all singing together. I rarely found that in orchestra, even though, again, I enjoyed violin and I was in orchestra as a kid. I felt like choir just sort of naturally got me to that, I don't know, transcendent place. That is one of the reasons I love music. So that was a huge part of it for me.
Wonderful. So when you say transcendent, it's almost like you're connecting with the divine, for instance, would be another way I might say something like that. Would that
Yeah.
be what you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And then also just a really strong connection to the group and kind of, feeling like we're having this experience together.
Yeah. I mean, singing is just, it's so interesting in terms of as an instrument, because we can say that the voice is an instrument. Some people don't
Mm-hmm.
realize that it is an instrument. But when we use it, we're using our whole bodies and we're getting extra oxygen into our bodies. We're having to stand a certain way. So it changes your posture, and that can change how you feel about yourself, your mental health even.
Mm-hmm.
And that sense of community when you sing in a group, of course, is really, really good for connecting and feeling connected.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I that's interesting. And when you were going through your teenage years, I know that you had some misgivings about the sound of your voice. You didn't always like your voice, and that's something that I share. I didn't always like the sound of my voice, but for you, this was a lot more than just I don't like the sound of my voice. Would you like to tell people a little bit about your journey and what was happening for you in your teens? I'm presuming it started in your teens, but if it started earlier, go from there.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm non-binary and I came out, I think when I was 24, 25. So, but I'd been talking about it for years before that and just kind of nobody listened to me because I'm not, if you're binary trans, there are usually sort of things that you're saying and doing that are so obvious that people can't ignore it. But I was just kind of like, this just doesn't make sense to me. And
Now,
so for my,
can you explain that a little more? Because know that my listeners, particularly and in Ireland as well, they may not understand even some of the terminology you were using just then.
mm-hmm.
Can you explain that just a
Yeah.
tiny bit more so that we get that bit kind of clear before you keep going?
Yeah. So binary gender is the idea that there's just male and female, which is funny because that's a very new idea that has basically not existed in any culture ever because intersex people exist. So at the very least, there should be at least three genders. And if we look at biological markers, there would be something like 16 or 17 different genders. So just on a basic biological level, the binary doesn't really exist in the way that we talk about it. So when people say non-binary, they basically just mean anything outside of the male-female kind of dichotomy,
Okay.
which again, I just, don't really think exists, but in the sense that
Well,
it does, I'm outside of
I
it.
know in spiritual world we talk about that each person would have both feminine and masculine energy, and we all have
Mm-hmm.
yin and yang. So there's I think in some communities it's more acceptable that we're not just one thing, and that we will
Mm-hmm.
use different, we'll present in different ways in different environments, or for depending on the situation.
Yeah, so I use they, them pronouns, which are gender neutral pronouns, which also have a long history of being used, but they're back in vogue again. And the way that this played out in my voice is that even though I wasn't necessarily thinking about it this way, I've always been, or before I started testosterone, I was a high soprano. So when I was younger, I was always, singing the really high stuff in choir. And I remember just feeling like this top octave of my voice isn't really useful for anything except classical singing, right? Like there's a whole operatic repertoire, and I did not feel like standing on stage and just singing for 7 minutes, which is the sort of like high soprano repertoire. It's like, look what I can do. And I just had no interest in that. I mean, I learned some of the repertoire, but I didn't enjoy it other than that it's always fun to have a challenge, I guess. So it was, the challenge, but I really just didn't connect with the sound of my voice. And I also felt like my voice was very boring. So I also had just like a very sort of, I don't know. I don't want to sound too negative, but I always felt like it was just sort of like this very like bland Mozart kind of, soprano voice without a lot of like weight or color to it.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, one of the things in the system of voices, the soprano, contralto, etc., those different, a lot of those, the way that we classify voices are by weight and color and not just by range, right? So what I was kind of latching onto was what I wanted was more weight in my voice. So it wasn't just about the range. And so that's the main thing that being on testosterone has done. My range has come down some, but my voice is also a lot thicker and my vocal cords are literally thicker. That's what it does.
So interesting, because I think most people have trouble loving their own voice. You know, that especially, when we record our voices, everybody's like, no, I can't listen to
Yeah.
that. When I was in college, I studied jazz music, and everything that we played, I transposed down to, and I mezzo soprano voice. If you go by category, I don't generally categorize my students because I don't work with classical singers myself when I'm teaching, but I have taken classical lessons, and I was a mezzo soprano, but I didn't want to, and that type of tone tends to be bright and light and fresh. People would always say I had a very young voice. They would think I was much younger than I was. When I was in my late 20s and 30s and even late 30s, people thought, I was in my 20s because of the tone that I, used in my voice. And also during college years, I would just try to sing everything really, really low, which wasn't really working with what I had and working with my sweet spot in my voice. But it's an interesting journey for anyone to start to accept your voice and just make decisions around that. So, you made a decision that was going to actually change the quality and tone of your voice, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And then there's lots of other ways. I don't know if you've studied or looked at the Estill method of voice production. It
No, I
might be
haven't.
of interest to you because it talks about, one of the things that the larynx, moves up and down, and the muscles and the tendons within the larynx in your neck, basically, for those of you who were wondering what I'm talking about. But those things are things that we can sometimes control, but it takes a lot of effort to learn that and change the tone of your voice. So when you started on your testosterone and your voice started to change, that must have been quite a difficult time though as well, because you were trying to make sound, but you obviously weren't going to know what was going to come out. So I'm presuming that you took a few steps backwards with your kind of technique and and getting pure tone and quality while
Yes.
you were figuring that out.
Yeah, quite a bit. And it's been a very interesting journey because before I started, and I started on a very low dose to have slow changes, but before I started, I had never really struggled vocally ever. It's not entirely true, but like the basic classical repertoire that I was doing, as long as I practiced, I was just fine with whatever I was doing. I just had, again, that kind of musical background and knowledge there. And then starting T and having just sometimes sounds come out that are not what I expect at all. Sometimes they're, a fourth away, not just that I'm singing out of tune, but like I literally like think I'm producing a shape for something, and then it just comes out a completely different part of my, part of what would have been my range before. And I've had to I basically started from scratch, I think, in terms of just, allowing things to come out, which is something I think a lot of people do early on, is just kind of like, all right, we're going to try to make a healthy sound production and see what happens. Right.
Yeah, and it's a
Yeah.
scary kind of feeling, especially because most of the time when something comes out that we don't expect, we feel we'll be judged for that. There's like
Mm-hmm.
if I understood or if I knew what I was doing, it would be better. But actually, with something like singing, no matter how much you understand the thing, you still have to try it. It's like trial and error learning a lot of the time.
Yes. And also having the technical background to be able to do what you want does not automatically mean that you're going to be happy with your voice. I can say someone that was recording and performing and just, I would listen to it and I remember just thinking most of the time, like, oh, that's kind of boring. I just didn't like the way my voice sounded overall,
And
even though I
now,
was
is
getting
that
paid.
different for you?
Yes. Yeah. I feel much more comfortable. And it's funny because my voice isn't that different. It's maybe, I mean, my speaking voice is about an octave lower, which is amazing.
Yeah,
Even though I still get mostly gendered female on the phone. I had a very high pitched voice before. My singing voice is, I've got actually almost an octave, added to the bottom of my range, but
beautiful.
mostly it's just the overall sound. And I feel like I can get a much bigger, thicker sound than I
Yeah,
could before,
like a
and in like
richness.
exactly a richness, and then also just a more useful part of my range because I used to mostly get volume above the treble staff. That was where my voice like turned on, and yeah, I feel like this is much more useful.
Absolutely. And I think that the classical training for singing is only for classical type of singing. You know, there's,
Exactly.
I mean, it's a limiting in some ways. And I certainly found that, you know, that I didn't like the way I would sing hymns. And I know you came from church music as a young
Hmm.
kid, and there was just a certain way that those things are sung, and especially if you're singing within choir. And I just didn't. It didn't sound like me. It didn't sound natural. And for me,
Hmm.
I actually did some music lessons with a speech level singing coach in
Mm,
San Francisco when I lived there. And that
cool.
changed things for me because it was like I was making uglier sounds, like I was leaning into the voice, leaning into the vocal
Hmm.
folds a little more. And it just meant that when I sang, it sounded almost like speaking. And I started to realize that there's actually a lot more you can learn. And a lot of people don't realize this because they don't understand the voice as an instrument. It's like you can play a guitar with your fingers making chords and your hand strumming or finger picking, or you can lie it on its side and do Hawaiian style. Like there's lots of ways to play most instruments. But if you've grown up with only one way, it can be hard to see those possibilities until you try them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Um,
to get through that process of experimentation and not liking the way that it sounds for a long time.
How long did that take for you to start to feel like you really like now your voice more?
Yeah. So the first, it's been actually coming on 4 years now. And the first year, just because I was on a low dose, it was so subtle and gradual that I didn't really notice too much. And then there was about a year of uh, feeling like it was just totally out of control, and I just like couldn't control it too much. And I wasn't trying to, because that's actually how people often damage their voice when they're transitioning, is they try to like, especially going downwards, they try to like muscle their voice down and stay at the very bottom of their range and be really growly, and you can, damage your chords, or at the worst get nodes. And when I was looking, I had been looking online for years for advice from other classical. What I was looking for specifically was classical singers, because I knew that I was going to continue to want to, record and perform. And there are some, but it was hard to find much info. So that's one of the reasons I want to talk about it, is because I feel like it can be really hard for people. There's a lot of stuff out there from people who are like, oh yeah, I'm a amateur singer. I love it. And I don't really care if anything happens to my voice.
Mm.
And I was like, no, I'm going to care. I'm going to really care if
Yes.
something
And
really
is that
terrible
something that
happens.
you work with people? Do you have, I mean, because I know you do coaching. I'm not familiar with
Mm-hmm.
the kind of coaching you do, but do you coach like music, musically, or is it just general life coaching that you tend to do? And have you worked with anyone like yourself?
Yes. So I do general life coaching and I teach music. But actually, the way that I got into life coaching was because my voice students in particular were coming to me with essentially life problems. And I was like, it's so weird. I feel like my voice students, especially, are treating me like a therapist. And sometimes they would literally say, could we not sing today and just talk? So I was
I've had that
having that in
experience.
lessons. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's because voice is so personal and psychological, and so affected by your focus. And it's on a lot of instruments you can sit and practice for hours and hours and not pay too much attention. I don't recommend it. I'd rather you focus and practice for less time, but like people, you
Yeah.
can, right? You can sit and just repeat and repeat. You can't really do that with voice because you'll wear yourself out. So I feel like that, yeah, there's just it's much more personal and psychological than a lot of instruments.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, our voice doesn't lie. That's the big
Hmm.
thing. So if you're having an emotional day, unlike playing on a piano, your voice it will let you know that I'm having an emotional day.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to communicate with you. So it's really interesting that how you got into life coaching, because something similar has been happening to me as well. Um, and sometimes a student will literally apologize because they think that they should be asking me for, or we should be singing, but that isn't what's going on for them on that particular day, and they can't really do the singing thing on
Right.
that day if the other stuff is in the way. So it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it, between teacher and student in that way?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the main things I've noticed as well with transitioning is that more than ever before, my practice session might need to just be, quote, warm ups.
Hmm.
So, we're usually warming up so that we can get to the repertoire, the song. And if I am warming up and I'm having to focus a lot for just really basic placement, or to feel like I'm, singing with ease and not hurting myself, then I just do that. And that's been a really interesting shift to just really see any aspect of using my voice, even if it's humming or, because I'll like hum when I go on walks because it's good for breath training and so forth, stuff like that. Because I see all of this as part of a broader vocal practice and not just the performance or, finishing a piece.
And I think what's really interesting, I had a student earlier today, and due to COVID, she's been living more on her own with one other adult in the house. And she came to me after a bit of a break, and she's just had her grandkids around. And I was like, wow, your voice is you've so much more range, because she's been using her voice differently. She's been making funny voices, reading books. She's been using her voice in such a way that it allowed her to transition very quickly to singing well. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for anybody who loves to sing, that sometimes they need to be reminded that you need to be using your voice every day, and try not to be a hermit and stay away from people too much, even if it's phone calls or just humming. Like you said, humming is a beautiful, gentle way to be using your voice every day.
Yeah.
Mm, really good. Okay, tell me a little bit more now about your composing, because do you use the piano or the violin for composing? Because I know you've said you play both.
Yes, I use both. I have been, so composition is what my 2 degrees are in. So I started out in violin performance and then I switched to composition midway through undergrad and then got my master's in composition. So I would say that's my main thing at this point. And it's interesting because I'd seen myself as a performer, at least half a performer or 3/4 of a performer pretty much through undergrad. And then when I went and got a master's, I was like, oh, okay, I'm committing to this, to composing. And one of the things that I've been able to do, which is cool because I have a performance background, is I've done a number of short film scores where I'm able to write for myself, essentially. So I write for piano, violin, voice, and then I can record it myself and keep the budget low. So that's been really, really fun. And when you are writing for yourself, you can write things that work for your voice right now. So even as my voice has been changing, I've been able to write things, that maybe the range is smaller than it would have been before, just because that's where I can kind of keep a consistent sound today. Or literally sometimes, going to record and realizing, oh, my voice is not going to do what I was hoping for today. So, but I wrote it, so I can change it.
That's really useful and handy. And do you have a big interest in working with film more in the future?
Yeah, I really love film. I'm definitely going to keep doing it.
Mm, interesting. So the the things that you're most passionate about that you mentioned in your bio: disability justice, trans rights, and trauma recovery through the arts. Um, is any of that something that you would like to tell people about right now, and how it might relate to voice work?
Yeah. So, disability, I'm autistic and I'm hypermobile, which is, so I injure very easily. I sprain very easily. And so that was one of the reasons that with violin that it was very difficult because I was having joint pain along with that.
Oh.
And so singing was actually the sort of the most accessible instrument. I could always do it I could always, find a position for my body, even if it was laying down, where I could warm up, versus violin, where you're kind of twisting your body into a strange shape and keeping it there for the remainder. There's not really too much. I mean, I've done Alexander technique and some other things to kind of deal with tension, but violin is sort of known for not being great for your body. What was the next one?
Oh, that was
Oh, trans
interesting,
rights.
though.
Well,
Right before
mhm,
we go on to trans rights,
mhm.
just like almost like choosing the right instrument for you. That's like such
Yes.
an so when you talk about you're autistic and you have the hypermobility, if you were advising, say, a parent of a kid that had some similar issues, what would you have said, say, to your parents early on that might have been useful in your journey?
Yeah, well, with both autism and ADHD, which have a lot of overlap, I would say what your kid is interested in, which can change, and it will change, right? It will change over time. But what they're interested in, let them try it, because that's going to be more fun than just handing them an instrument and saying, do this thing.
Okay.
And singing is great because it's, again, so accessible. You don't have to buy anything other than, maybe a keyboard or something if you want that to kind of warm up with. But you can do it anywhere, and anybody can do it at any time. So I always love that.
That's perfect, because just in case anybody was interested in what would be, your advice. Um, so yeah, let's move on to trans rights.
Mhm. Yeah. So being non-binary, I identify as transgender also, and that's just important to me. I mean, queer rights in general, they're all related for sure. But there's definitely, in America, we're still working on the federal protections for trans people. So care about
Yes,
that a
and
lot.
how has that affected you a lot? Like through, I mean, you went through your transition mainly in your 20s. Well, you started your
Hmm.
hormone therapy in your 20s, but did
Yep.
you experience a lot of bullying, or was there a lot of difficulty for you in your teen years around that?
I was homeschooled, so there was nobody around to bully me. But for the most part, I mean, I've been in Massachusetts for the last 11 years, which is, I mean, it certainly has its issues and certainly a lot of racism. But as a white person and as a queer person, for the most part, I've probably only had a few incidents here, versus, there are definitely places that are a lot harder to live. So
Mm.
and there's, state healthcare here. So I've actually had most of my transition elements covered by healthcare really well. It's
Oh,
been
that's
great.
awesome. That's really
Yeah.
great. That's really, really great. Um, and trauma recovery through the arts then is that something that you do through your life coaching, or what way do
Yeah.
you do
So
you work that?
I had a very volatile and traumatic childhood. So I have complex PTSD, and also had some things happen as an adult. So that's been something. And actually, music has been, over the course of my life, one of the main things that has helped me. So even before I knew what, any of this work was, I was using music to process feelings and, get in touch with my body, which is a big thing that people with PTSD are often have trouble connecting to their body. And you have to connect to your body to be able to sing, because you need the feedback loop. You need to be getting information back from your body and not just telling it what to do. You need to know what those messages are doing, right? So it requires a certain amount of connection to your body
And awareness,
and
obviously.
awareness. Exactly, right. So yes, I have done a lot of trauma, and I have a certification in somatic embodiment, and I'm actually doing a year-long program right now to learn a bunch of trauma things that are geared toward therapists. Obviously, I'm not becoming a therapist. I'm just, this is one of my main areas of interest. And I also am very interested in something called voice movement therapy, which is basically making sounds, making movements, and kind of like letting things come out. And for a lot of people, like when I've done that work, a lot of the people in the room have never done that before, right? Have never explored the full range of their voice. I've seen people discover that they have, 2 octaves higher a voice than they realize just from letting their body make noises. And the goal for that is not to then go and become a singer, but I think it's a really cool modality as an art therapy.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's interesting when you, especially if you make something playful.
Yes.
It can really unlock sound in people, and that even just unlocking tension. When you talked about the PTSD, and how your body kind of reacts to that, and a lot of people feel a lot of shame around their voice because they don't like the way it sounds, or they've been told that they don't have a good
Hmm.
singing voice. What would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, I actually had a voice student who was bullied a lot around her voice. And so that was something that we talked about quite a bit. And I guess the main thing I would tell people is that you're the only one that gets to decide what your voice means and why you're using it, right? So there are a lot of performers, a lot of famous performers who don't have necessarily the most traditionally great singing voice, right? I mean, Bob Dylan is kind of one that people joke about as, being a great songwriter, but not necessarily a great singer. Yet he has, a very particular style, which is very recognizable. And there's so much that you can do professionally, even if you're not the best at one particular technical aspect of the thing. You can always find examples of people who have, a really unusual vibrato, for example, which I know a lot of people have feelings about their vibrato or lack thereof, or, don't have a very big range, right? They're professional singers who work with a range of an octave and a half, and that's just what they do. So, yeah, I guess that's my main piece of advice is you get to decide why you're doing this and then make it happen. Because ultimately, people that are saying negative things to you to shut you down, that's really about them, I think, and not about you.
That's really good. That's profound, and it's so true. So, we are coming towards the end of our interview, and I wanted to start wrapping things up. But I know we're going to be listening to one of your pieces of music
Mhm.
in a few minutes, and I'd love to, if you'd like to introduce that and tell us a little bit about. Um, Actually, one question I wanted to ask you was, some people will be wondering, is there much of a difference between the idea of being a songwriter versus being a composer? Because I know this piece that you've done for us it's like, would you describe it as
A
a
song.
song? A
Yeah.
song, yeah.
Yeah.
So
And I
if
would
you
say
wouldn't
that
mind
it's kind of a pop song. Yeah.
oh, great, okay. And so is it quite different from the other composing work that you do?
So I actually write a lot of songs. I have never produced a full album of that, although that is one of my goals in the next year. So I'm like, okay, fine. I've written like 100 songs that I like. I should finally make an album. So this song I wrote probably 6 or 7 years ago. It's fairly short. It's called Midas Touch, and it's about. It's an extended metaphor, basically, about having touched someone and turned them to gold. Right, that classic mythical story. And so I took a recording that I had made with my sister Rochelle Lene, who is a singer-songwriter, and that's her playing piano, and then it's me singing 5 years ago, so soon before I started T. And it's funny because a lot of trans people have recorded duets of themselves with their like current and former voice, and so everybody does that, and I was like, that's basically what I'm doing is I added in a couple of lower harmony parts. And the original track, it's funny because when we were recording it, my sister was like, "Are you sure you want to sing so breathy?" Because I don't. But I was like, "Yes, I'm doing this on purpose. I'm trying to have this sound, this kind of feeling." And so I'm kind of trying to match that with the harmony parts, and then at the very end, I'm kind of letting my current thicker voice come out a little bit. So that's the
Wonderful.
song.
Now we really look forward to listening to that in a moment. So if you would like to get in touch with Mattia, they have a fantastic, you've got your website. Is there any other way that you'd like to invite people to connect with you?
You are welcome to find me on Facebook. I'm the only Mattia Maurée on the internet, so I'm usually pretty easy to find. And I'm also on Instagram at Puffling Moo, which is a baby puffin and the noise that it makes.
Wonderful. And I will be putting those details into the description notes with the various forms of the podcast as they come out. So is there anything that you'd like to say in general to our listeners before we finish up?
I really love your message of your voice matters. I really, really strongly feel that. Even if you have no desire to record or perform or, become a big entertainer, you singing for yourself, you singing at home, singing, for your family, all of these things are really meaningful. And I think that singing is really baked into the human experience. We've been singing and language developed simultaneously as far as we can tell. So it's a huge part of how we function. And we've added a bunch of instruments onto that. But I really think that voice is sort of the original instrument, and it connects you to your body. It connects you to other people. And I really recommend just playing with it and not taking yourself too seriously.
That's beautiful. Okay, thank you so much, Mattia. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. And I encourage anybody who's listening to sing and connect with Mattia or myself, or find a next step. Join the choir in the local church, or whatever is your next step. Sometimes we can be afraid to take it, but it is, don't be afraid to just try. And I think we both have a similar value for music and value for singing. So I'm just so pleased that you were able to come on board. And I hope that anybody who's listening really feels that, yes, you do matter.
Yes. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
again, and bye-bye.
Midas touch, I loved you too much, and now you're cold. We never argue anymore. Open your eyes and I'll touch you again, and this time you'll see. Open your hand and I'll finger your skin.